All right, so our first question is from Garrett, and he says, you mentioned that fructose is much better absorbed alongside glucose, so I'm wondering if I can balance the glucose to fructose ratio by adding a bit of white rice to my higher fructose fruit. Would this also make the fruit not high FODMAP? So this is a great question. There's a lot of detailed things to get into here as far as how fructose gets absorbed in the intestines, whether we need to be concerned about it feeding bacteria and being concerned about it as a FODMAP, as it potentially can be, depending on how well we're absorbing it. It can then go on to feed bacteria. So we'll discuss that, and also how you can determine if you need to be concerned about this in the fruits that you're eating based on the fructose to glucose ratio. And we'll also talk about why the typical categorization here of the fruits or foods that are excessively high in fructose isn't necessarily relevant. And there are some pretty significant issues there and disagreements we have in terms of some of the application of this. So we'll be talking about all of that, but as a starting place, we first just need to discuss how fructose actually gets absorbed in the intestines, because that will then inform how we can best absorb it and make sure that it's not being undigested and then heading on to, or unabsorbed and then heading on to feed bacteria. So Mike, why don't you start us off with that?
Sure. So I guess the first thing to understand is how fructose is actually absorbed in the intestine. And so there's two major transporters that control the absorption of fructose in the intestine, and it's actually a bit different than the absorption of glucose. So the major transporter of fructose in the intestine is GLUT5. So this is a receptor that takes fructose up from the lumen of the intestine and brings it into the intestinal cell. And then there's also GLUT2, which is seen with kind of like a co-transport with glucose that brings fructose again into the intestinal cell. And then also the GLUT2 moves the fructose from the intestinal cell into portal circulation. So you have these little receptors on the cells, or these little kind of transporters on the cells that take up the carbohydrates and move them across the intestine. Now, some things to keep in mind here is that the amount of these transporters and their functions are not stagnant overall. So basically, when you're exposed to higher fructose intakes, your ability to absorb fructose actually increases due to an increased expression of these different transporters and things along these lines. So basically, when you first start having fructose, you're not having a lot of fructose in your diet. When you increase it a bit, the amount that you'll absorb will increase over time due to changes in these transporters. At the same time, if there's a lot of intestinal inflammation and damage going on, you can also have a negative impact on the ability to actually uptake these carbohydrates due to adjustments in intestinal function related to some of the effects on these transporters. So the state of the intestine and the substrate that's being put into the intestine determine how well the intestine is able to absorb certain substrate like fructose. And fructose is a little bit different than glucose because in a large proportion of people, the ability to absorb fructose can be a bit impaired without having adequate amounts of glucose present. So if you don't have adequate amounts of glucose present, the ideal ratio is 1-to-1 glucose to fructose. And now, when you start to get over that, when you start to have more fructose over glucose, so the ratio becomes in favor of fructose, that's where you start to see people have issues, but there's a wide range of tolerance. Some people, 5 grams of fructose is a problem over glucose, and other people, it's upwards to 50 or more grams of fructose in a sitting. So there's also this individual variance in response to fructose overall. And so there's a lot of moving parts going on. For myself personally, the way I like to determine with clients how this works is, I'm not trying to do a test to measure their GLUT5 receptor activity. It's more just how much, you have foods that have higher or lower fructose, and you see if you have a negative response to them or not. You want to make sure that it is a fructose component, because that'll talk about some of the high fructose containing foods that people tend to have issues with also have FODMAPs. And so with that said, you want to make sure it's not the FODMAPs like a sugar alcohol like sorbitol that we would see in apples or versus the fructose itself. And so to answer this question specifically, can you add a bit of glucose in the form of maybe dextrose or white rice to other foods that are higher in fructose, and it will help to improve intestinal absorption of fructose? I think so, especially if your tolerance for it is low. You're one of the people close to that 5 grams of fructose over glucose. But at the same time, if the problem is not fructose related, if it's more of an issue of a FODMAP like a sugar alcohol like sorbitol or lactose or whatever lactose wouldn't count, but it's more of a function of one of these FODMAPs, then the adding sugar or adding glucose wouldn't necessarily help that. It's just in the case of fructose. That's why it's important to understand with the different foods what type of fermentable fibers they have in them as well. The other thing I want to mention here is the major problem that I see with fructose malabsorption, especially so with fruits, I think this is less of an issue because of the polyphenol compounds and fibers present. But when we look at the studies and you do a bunch of free fructose feeding, or you have high sources of free fructose that doesn't have a lot of polyphenol components and fibers, then the bacteria in the gut with the free fructose feeding can start to produce endotoxin, and this starts to create inflammatory responses and issues overall. So that's kind of that would be my rundown on fructose specifically.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the free fructose in that latter context, you're talking about excessive free fructose over the amount of glucose present, right?
Well, I'm saying even if they were just to feed them pure fructose, because that's what happens in the studies is like, here's a 75 gram bolus of pure fructose in a solution, and let's just see how it goes. And it's like, it's probably going to go bad for the vast majority of people when you look at the fructose malabsorption studies. And then to try to understand what's going on metabolically without understanding that piece is pretty questionable, because it's like this is not about absorption now. This is about how are you dealing with endotoxin and malabsorption of fructose in the different studies.
Right, exactly. And that's pretty much never going to be a good thing. And so that's what even led to, is one of the main things that have led us to talk about this previously, is looking at the sugar and fructose research. In the vast majority of time, whether it's for rats or humans, they're giving free, pure fructose way in excess of glucose, or sometimes with zero glucose, as you said. And then this is a question of just purely feeding bacteria endotoxin production and the impacts of that, rather than it having anything to do with fructose. And so that's what has led to, I think, the question of that's being asked here, because as we've said, you need to have glucose alongside the fructose to absorb it. And so just to get into that in a little bit of detail, as you said, there are two primary receptors that help to transport fructose in the intestines. There's the GLUT5 and the GLUT2. The GLUT5 is always there, and it just transports fructose, and it's a pretty low capacity relative to the GLUT2, which has a much higher capacity for transporting fructose. And the GLUT2 receptor is basically recruited when a different receptor, the SGLT1 receptor, is active and is transporting glucose. So that is why having the glucose alongside the fructose helps. Basically, it increases the activity of the SGLT1 transporter, which then helps to recruit the GLUT2 transporter, which allows for increased fructose absorption. And this is important, right? This is why feeding excess fructose can be an issue. But as you were saying, the amount of excess fructose that is an issue will vary considerably, right? Could be as little as 5 grams on the much worse side, or as high as over 50 grams on the other side. And it's going to vary, as you said, based on gut health, bacterial issues, general inflammatory state, thyroid function, metabolism, all of that. And so that then, when we're looking at specific foods, we need to consider all these things, right? We need to consider our particular tolerance. As you said, testing is generally the best way to identify that. But the problem with testing, as you said, is most of these foods that have excess fructose don't only have excess fructose. They have other potentially fermentable carbohydrates as well. And a good way to test it would be exactly what Garrett was saying, which is you bring in some extra glucose alongside it and see if that helps with the digestion symptoms that you're getting, let's say from an apple. If it does help, then we know in our case it was an excess fructose issue and a fructose malabsorption issue. If it doesn't help, then we know some other fermentable carbohydrate or some other aspect of the food that was causing the digestive issue. So that's kind of the big picture concept here. It's also worth mentioning that so having the glucose to fructose in a 1-to-1 ratio is almost always enough to fully prevent any fructose malabsorption. But there's actually, you can get away with a bit more than that. So because of the way that the recruitment happens, you can get away, let's say if you have 25 grams of glucose and a little bit extra fructose, let's say 30 or 35 grams, that is often better than just having the 5 to 10 grams of free fructose with zero glucose. There's the glucose helps in more than a 1-to-1 ratio, but again, it's really hard to identify because of the way that the studies are done. There's so much different variability in the different protocols and the people that are being looked at, and there's just such variation there, which is why you have a range of anywhere from 5 to over 50 grams of free fructose before it becomes an issue. So a lot of variables here, but it's also worth considering that if you're eating something that maybe it has 5 to 10 grams of excess free fructose when you're having 60 grams of carbs, that might not be an issue, even if you have an issue with 5 to 10 grams of pure fructose. Although also, how do you even know that unless you were just trying pure free fructose, which almost no one does. So just different kind of intricacies here that are worth considering. And but it is worth, again, mentioning here that having some glucose is very helpful. And so that then brings us to the question of, is this an issue with different foods that we might be eating? And normally when it comes to the fructose to glucose ratio, this is one of the biggest issues I have. I mean, when it comes to the general idea of FODMAPs, it's a great idea, but in practice, I think there's a lot of, or in application, I think there's a lot of missteps, and this is one of them. A lot of times when looking at the fructose to glucose ratio, only free fructose and free glucose are considered, and the other carbohydrates like sucrose are not considered. And that makes a huge difference because, and we'll get into this with something like a mango, which has a lot of sucrose and much less free glucose and free fructose. If you just look at the free values, you're going to have a ratio of fructose to glucose of almost 3. But if you add in the 50% glucose and 50% fructose that you're getting from the sucrose, you then have a ratio that's just over 1. It's like 1.3, almost 1.4. And so that's something that's really important to consider when you're looking at the carbohydrate composition of the foods, that you don't only consider the amount of free glucose and free fructose, but also the amount of glucose and fructose that are in the sucrose that can be in the foods. So that's one thing that's important to consider. And with that in mind, when it comes to fruits, there are really only a few that have a pretty high fructose to glucose ratio when sucrose is considered. And this would be pears, apples, watermelon, and mango. But there's a pretty huge variation between them. So when we're looking at apples and pears, the fructose to glucose ratio, all carbs considered, ends up being around 2.5. And so just one apple or just one pear could be enough to get your 5 grams of excess fructose, which if you are compromised gut-wise could be an issue. If you're not compromised, and as you were saying, Mike, you're used to consuming carbs, like you normally consume carbs, including fructose, or even just glucose, you're going to be better at absorbing it, and 5 grams of free fructose probably won't even be an issue. But if you are sensitive, just one apple, just one pear could be enough. When it comes to watermelon and mango, the fructose to glucose ratios are about 1.3 to 1.5. So nowhere near as significant as apples and pears, but enough that if you're having a pretty decent amount of carbs from those things, you could get 5 to 10 grams of excess fructose. But it would really require, if you're trying to get 10 grams of excess fructose, you would need over 50 grams of net carbs from watermelon and over 65 from mango. So we're talking about pretty high amounts of carbs here, net carbs, in order to actually get to a level of excess free fructose where it's an issue. So if we're sensitive, we might want to keep an eye on those types of fruits. If we're not sensitive, then it probably won't be an issue for you. So that's something that's really important when we're talking about any food, any sort of carbohydrate or other type of food that can cause digestive issues when we're compromised. When it comes to choosing foods, creating a diet with that in mind, I've created the Energy Balance Food Guide to help you determine exactly what types of foods will work well if you're compromised in terms of your digestion, and if you're not, what kinds of foods will work well in terms of supporting your metabolism and allowing you to improve, sleep, hormones, digestion, increased energy, all those types of things. Basically, the Energy Balance Food Guide, it's a 1-page infographic, and it organizes foods on a spectrum based on how effectively they support your metabolism, and it has a separate spectrum that adjusts the scale in the case that you are dealing with digestive issues like the ones that we're referring to. So you can head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download that free Energy Balance Food Guide. And that leads me to just one other food that I wanted to mention to consider when it comes to a high fructose to glucose ratio, and that's agave syrup. And agave is often used as a sweetener because it's very low glycemic, and it's low glycemic because it's really, really high in fructose. but it's really easy, especially because it's used as a sweetener, to have excess fructose when you're consuming agave. And I've seen that in people, especially who are already having digestive issues, that then they consume something that's sweetened with it, or they see it and they're like, oh, that's low glycemic, and so it must be healthy, and it causes a lot of digestive issues. So that's definitely one to be aware of when it comes to the fructose to glucose ratio.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to add specifically is that even if you don't have a problem with the excess free fructose for watermelon, mango, pear, and apple, the other FODMAPs in them, so fructins, which are like chains of fructose, like fructooligosaccharides or something like inulin, and then also the sugar alcohols are still a pretty big concern for a lot of people who have digestive issues. And so even if it's not a fructose issue, it could specifically be a FODMAP issue. And people who are dealing with digestive problems, like you have, bloating, gas, IBS, SIBO, things like this, those fruits are still going to be an issue even if you don't have an issue specifically with fructose. And also people coming out of a low carb diet, they're coming from carnivore, they're coming from keto, they're coming from low carb paleo, will still likely have problems with those foods because of the FODMAPs. And also for those people, there's a transition coming out of those diets where gut function has to upregulate to deal with carbohydrates versus the fats, and probably shift the microbiome in the colon and all of these different components, and also have the liver kind of adjust and the body adjust metabolically to the carbohydrate. So you may find initially that you will have a negative effect with some of these, especially the ones that you mentioned, Jay, agave syrup, pear, apple, watermelon, what was the other one? Mango. So you'll see the effects with those foods, but over time, as you expand the dietary sources, you get to tolerate carbohydrates a bit better. You'll probably find that your tolerance will increase and the amounts that you may be able to have will increase. But if it doesn't, some people just don't do well with certain FODMAPs. Like there's quite a few people I work with where it's like mango is just not going to be a good option in large quantities because every time they have it, they get bloating and gas. And so you may be able to have some, but there's also the point that you may never really be able to tolerate it super well. And again, that's because of the FODMAP. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have a gut dysbiosis or that your intestines are impaired or that you have IBS. It's just that you don't do well with those FODMAPs. The microbiome is creating symptoms for you. And there's not really anything specific to do about that unless you want to start playing around with the microbiome and see if that makes a difference. But for a lot of people that I've worked with and in my experience, I haven't seen people tolerate some of these foods super well in the long run. And it's not even a fructose problem, it's a FODMAP problem. So I think when looking at these things, it's always important to understand context, like where are you at right now? And then also your individual variability in response to different foods. And this plays out as well with other foods. As an example, like I can tolerate, for example, broccoli fine, which does have FODMAPs. I don't get bloating and gas from it. But I get pretty bad bloating and gas from something like yams, and the FODMAP content and fiber is very different, and then the microbiome interacts with it in a different way. So these are all important things to understand with this overall.
Totally. And that's, I think, part of what falls short with the simplified kind of low FODMAP approach. I mean, even just the fact that fructose is universally considered to be a FODMAP, which I think is something we need to be careful with, just like we're describing. Like it takes a pretty decent amount of these foods to get any excess fructose that is normally known to cause an issue. So same with lactose. That's another one on there where our ability to digest and break down lactose can vary considerably and improve as our gut health improves, thyroid health improves, can also improve based on what we're consuming with the lactose. So having sugar with the lactose actually helps us break it down and absorb it. So there's so many things like that to consider that we don't want to have some sort of rigid idea around those sorts of carbohydrates being an issue. And as you were saying, Mike, as well, there's a ton of other types of FODMAPs that may or may not be causing an issue. So those would all be things I'd be thinking about, things I would consider. And again, coming back to the question, just to wrap up, trying a bit of glucose, whether it's dextrose or white rice, alongside the foods would help to rule out whether or not it is a fructose issue and help you identify if it is maybe a different FODMAP that you're struggling with. The other thing I wanted to mention there is there's certain things that are not considered when it comes to FODMAPs that may potentially be FODMAPs. depending on your digestive capacity. And starch is one of those. You may or may not effectively break down starch, and there's different types of starches. And we've talked about this before, amylose, amylopectin. We talked about resistant starches in a recent episode that I'll link back to. And so that's a whole other area that we would also need to consider. And so again, there can be complexity here. It can definitely, it requires the nuance and understanding of these things in order to effectively make the changes and tweaks so that you can identify what sorts of foods might be feeding bacteria and causing issues for you.
Yeah.